clearly what's happening now is not working for most people. And clearly only through practices of acting and living against it will other possibilities that could be forged into better certainties become possible. It all sounds very la-di-da. It's not la-di-da. It's really, really fucking hard. Changing paradigms in science never happens overnight. Changing the shape of a river takes, sadly, centuries. The one thing that can move fast, obviously, is power. You can get, massive corporations can build dams, and so can nation states in a day. So doing it, from below, changing the riverbed of our thoughts from below through collective action, is harder work.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Natasha Lennard. Natasha is the Associate Director of the Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism Graduate Program at the New School for Social Research in New York and a columnist for The Intercept. She's also the author of 2 books which have been published with Verso Books. The first, Violence, Humans in Dark Times, and the second, Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life. She's currently writing her 3rd book on certainty and uncertainty, and that was what she joined me to discuss today. Natasha walks us through how we currently conceptualise crisis and certainty, and how once we have an understanding of that conceptualisation, we can become more aware of the relationships between certainty and doubt, the difference between certainty and knowledge, and how inculcated certainties arise from culture, from collective meaning-making, ensuring that we can move the frontiers of certainty, reject things that we think to be certain, like, for example, capitalism, and venture into the realm of uncertainty in order to challenge, experiment, and joyously resist violent norms. This is a really stunning conversation about how we make sense of the world together, how we know already the things that we need, and how we can let go of the things to which we cling. This is about more than conceptualizing certainty and uncertainty. This is about how we conceptualize the world that we live in order to imagineer the world that we wish for tomorrow. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Natasha, thank you so much for joining me on Planet Critical. It is a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Hello. Hello.
My first question for you is, why is the world in crisis?
I'm so glad that we start with such an easy question that I can answer in 10 seconds. I'm among the thinkers that, I'm certainly not alone in wanting to think conjuncturally about this. Like, are we thinking about a moment of a critical conjuncture wherein we're seeing the culmination of a set of forces and hierarchies and modes of living come together in a way that seems impossible to continue and then is facing this moment of rupture? Or are we in the kind of crisis that is made more permanent? So what I want to think about first before saying why the world is in crisis is kind of, what do we mean by crisis? It's this term we talk about all the time, right? We talk about various economic crises. We talk about, of course, the climate crises. People, certainly a problematically bipartisan political coalition, talks about the migrant crisis, border crisis. And very little do we actually spend time on the concept of crisis itself. And it's, in a weird way, a somewhat inappropriate one for the moment, especially in its more kind of historical usage. So crisis did used to it had a couple of meanings. And I want to reference the famed German historian Reinhard Koselleck, who's one of the only people that really gave us a proper etymological history of the term crisis. And in the ancient usage, so Greek and Roman, it had two meanings that would sort of be used simultaneously. And one was medical. So the crisis point was the moment in a disease where a decision had to be made as to whether a certain treatment would return the patient and the body to health, or the patient would die, and the disease would become terminal. So that's that critical point at which decision-making needs to happen. The other was more eschatological and related more to Judgment Day. So a kind of theological meaning of crisis and end times. And we see these both meanings in our contemporary usage that has been pretty common as a sort of political term since the Enlightenment. So Koselleck goes back to Rousseau. So what does that mean? That we've got something that's end times, critical decision-making, and supposed to bring things to a head, but then is also, in its same way nowadays, used to describe a permanent state of affairs. So it's this really promiscuous term, but yet we use it really casually to talk about continuous state of affairs and our perceptions of it. So this is a very roundabout way to say it kind of depends what we mean by crisis. If we're going to ask, why is the world in crisis? Why is the world facing sets of catastrophes? I mean, that's the constellation of capitalism, which is born of 500 years of colonial, racialized world order. That is the, decimation of organized labor in so much of the world. That is poisoned geopolitics. That is, this conjuncture. But is it critical insofar as, is it falling apart? Or are we in a state of really pernicious and violent management? And that actually there's not going to be some sort of critical point where this rupture leads to some new expectations and horizons. So I kind of want us to be using crisis in a way that speaks to rupture and otherwise worlds. But I kind of worry that we're using it in a way that's a bit more like the doctor that returns the patient to not health, but their life and like livability. And so I'd like to think of a more rupturous critical moment that would allow for new ways of being. But I think we're seeing rather a lot of repressive crisis management. Very long, windy, not particularly clear answer to your question.
No, I think it is. And I want to go off in multiple different directions, but to reference your essay, which is sort of why I reached out to you for an interview, I think something that is quite interesting within sort of the different communities talking about crisis with regards to this like medical definition is there is a comfort in the certainty of knowing something will become terminal, that the uncertainty of rupture or the uncertainty of otherwise worlds, even though there's a possibility for something better, actually cannot provide in the moment. And I think that speaks to kind of the psychological pressures that we're under right now in an increasingly precarious society and an increasingly critical conjuncture in history. That we find comfort almost in the idea of something being doomed, rather than finding solace in the possibility of otherness.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I do, because I think it's interesting that actually the term crisis and the term certain have the same etymological cognates. They're cognates essentially from the Greek kri, which used to mean as a cognate, to decide and judge. So it's interesting at this very same moment where like we talk of crisis and the popularization of the term polycrisis. The other thing that's invoked all the time from, political stump speeches to newsletters that you get every morning from various newspapers and magazines to like my bosses, it's uncertain times, right? It's like we live in these uncertain times, stock up on your vitamins in these uncertain times. And that seems to be as much of a kind of common phrase for describing the now as these crisis times, which shouldn't be super surprising, right? If you're in crisis, it's because you have a problem that's unresolved, and therefore there's uncertainty and there's a kind of seeking for certainty. And what I've been interested in doing is kind of turning our eyes away from these gestures, very vague and broad gestures, to uncertainty, and saying, like, actually, we're not in this time of totalized uncertainty. First of all, just philosophically, as an epistemological claim, you can't really make sense of totalized doubt, right? You have to be standing somewhere on firm ground of sorts to be in the position of doubting at all. And it was the late, great Ludwig Wittgenstein, Stein, my beloved dead gay boyfriend, who made this claim about the impossibility of totalized doubt. So you can't doubt everything. So we're not actually in a world of totalized uncertainty, but that's not necessarily a good thing. So what does it mean that certain things are held certain? And that's what I kind of want to be addressing. If we're talking about crisis, if we're talking about uncertainty, I also want to be able to really interrogate collectively what sort of world ordering certainties are held stable, are the hinges around which we ask questions of doubt and what to do next and how to manage XYZ set of like brutalities, violences, crises. So it's actually what's held certain, which I think we have a lot of problems with. And pointing to uncertainty in the same way, gesturing vaguely to crisis, can be misleading, and it can also be politically manipulative. So, for example, when you talk about defund the police, obviously has been a call, especially where I am in the US, for decades within Black radical organizing, but certainly loudly, more broadly since 2020 and the George Floyd uprising. What's the ready response? What would you do without them? What with this kind of call to uncertainty that we don't know what life would look like without the carceral system as we have it, without policing as it currently exists? Well, we do know for certain what sort of racialized, propertied systems of hierarchy and power are held in place by policing as it functions and as it has been long functioning and functions evermore with ever more funding. Another example, this cloud of doubt that is pointed to when you think about young people transitioning, and people challenging their, presumed gender and the gender roles into which and sex roles into which children are inculcated. And we're all inculcated, gendered before we're named, so often. And then you see an increasing number of young people transitioning or deciding they're non-binary or experimenting. And then again and again and again, you get even, allegedly sympathetic media coverage and political responses that say, we just don't know. We're too afraid. There's this pernicious doubt that sits over this question when the kind of contrived and inculcated certainties of gender are held stable. So this is another way in which pointing to uncertainty rather than challenging what's held stable can become politically dangerous. What are other examples? The fact that we find it very, very difficult, myself included, to think outside of the purported certainties that we need to live in border regimes, right? The nation-state border regime is held extraordinarily stable as a world-ordering certainty in the way I'm using certainty, which is in this Wittgensteinian way, right? It's not something that is an absolute, but it is something that is treated and lived with as absolute. We live with borders as an assumed certainty. It's basically feels illegible to speak about world politics without them. But they're not these transhistorical objects. In the same way, gender as it functions in the kind of last 500 years of global racial empire is not transhistorical, but these are held very stable as certainties. And I'm more interested in looking at those and how we might want to budge them towards the terrains of doubt, rather than just empty gesturing towards our uncertain futures. I think we deserve better certainties and we deserve better uncertainties. And I don't think we get to that space without being able to prod at what is held certain and what isn't, and what's movable or not.
God, that's great. We deserve better certainties and better uncertainties. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think what I love in Vicken Stein's work, which I know a little bit of, but it was mostly through reading you that I kind of came to grapple with it, is this relationship between doubt and certainty that is revealed not to be an either or, but a both and. So like the necessity, as you said just at the beginning there, of having the firm ground of certainty upon which to stand in order to then doubt. And that it is impossible to doubt if one doubts everything. And so to me, that is quite, it's reminiscent of quite like Eastern philosophy, the both and rather than the either or. And it made me think about an essay that I read earlier in the year written by Elaine Scarry called The Body in Pain. And in it, she says that to have pain is to have certainty. And to hear about pain is, in essence, to have doubt, because we cannot know another's pain. Because the pain is sort of individualized and in the physical body. And I suppose your essay brought that to mind. Everything that you just said brought it to mind, because as you were saying, there is something profoundly important about our collective capacity to choose our certainties and our doubts.
You cut out.
And the relationship between one another that actually creates the capacity to have certainties and to have doubts, and how we can use these kind of cultural touchstones to move society. I love that you said to how can we budge towards how can we budge certain certainties towards doubt. And to me, that's what's so important in everything that you're saying, is that it's something that we fundamentally cannot do alone. It's something that has to be done collectively.
And this is what I also, find a lot of use, because Vicken Stein is not known as a political philosopher, right? And a lot of people resist. He's been used by the right, and he's been taken up by the left. I think he could be taken up even more by the left, of course. But he doesn't write explicitly, and never wrote specifically about politics. And certainly not social justice or anything like that. But what his work does that really lends to thinking that way, in a very, very basic way, is he articulates and explains why you can't make meaning alone. You quite simply can't. It's not how language works. Language works as a set of interlocking games through use. It's not like we get to know our way around the worlds of meaning and communication and collective designation by being handed some sort of dictionary that we work our way through at birth and onwards. We collectively make meaning together, and meanings change only through collective use. Like, you can't suddenly decide a word means something else on your own and start using it and expect people to understand. You'd then have to reference what you're doing into collective usage. I think it's interesting you bring up Scarry and the body, because I think it certainly relates. But it relates in an interesting way, because Wittgen Stein would say, actually, you totally can know if someone else is in pain there's no such thing as private pain, really, because pain, you learn the language of pain as a language. Sure, you can have a sensation that maybe I can't sit inside your body and have as sensation. But what do I understand pain as in the world? It's both sensation and expression. So, if I see you going, ow, ow, and clutching your head, I understand and know you to be having a headache, unless I have reason to learn otherwise, some sort of deception. But in as much as I can know I'm in pain, I can sort of know you're in pain too, because this is how we express pain through pain behavior. And I think thinking those things through together, actually, we come to the same point, which is we are able to make meaning together and only together and understand each other and be able to understand where doubts and certainties and what's held stable and isn't, where those lines lie. When do we become illegible to each other? So maybe we should kind of slow it down a bit with the Vicken Stein meaning of certainty, just to clarify, because it's not, it's not like it's not like everyone who's done a philosophy course will have come across this particularly. But what I really like is the Vicken Stein draws a distinction between certainty and knowledge. So he's very interested in the differences between what it's like to act with knowledge or to act with certainty. Okay, what's the difference? So if I say, I know I have two hands and I'm holding my two hands in front of me, I go, here's one. And this was the example that G. Moore, the philosopher that Vicken Stein is often responding to in these texts about certainty. It's his example. And he goes, look, here's one hand, here's another. I know I have two hands. And Vicken Stein says, like, look, I know what you've shown me here is you can't doubt that you have two hands. Like, there's no doubt there. There's no room for doubt. But you haven't actually shown knowledge. You've shown something of kind of a different texture. You've shown certainty. What's the difference? Knowledge, I have to offer further proof. Knowledge, I say, okay, I don't know the distance from here to my local train station. I've just moved here. How can I gain knowledge of it? Okay, well, I have a hypothesis and I test it through walking, or I take a tape measure, I ask friends, and then you gather knowledge. I don't know, you might have not known the year Queen Elizabeth died, and then you look in the news and you gather knowledge. And I can't even remember because I don't care. But something like I have two hands, there's no further proof. There's no questioning and then coming to offer evidence further than I have to hold it certain in order to live my life, in order to go about doubting it all with you, with everyone around me, that external objects exist, that the earth has existed since before I was born. Otherwise, we couldn't be asking the questions we do about the world in general. I couldn't open the door for you and know that you're going to walk out the door and not the window. We hold all these things certain. And those are the kind of what Vicken Stein calls Moore's everyday certainties of common sense. But what gets interesting politically is that it actually doesn't stop. These things that we hold stable, but offer no further and can offer no further proof for, these certainties, which are different from acting with knowledge, acting with these certainties, it doesn't stop at these very basic things like the existence of external object or that the earth is older than when I was born. It is clearly the categorization, the ontologization of the world as we live with it in many ways. So gender categories, racialization, border regimes, a lot of these, deep hegemonic ideological fixes in the world function just as much as certain common sense certainties that we actually don't want to do without. So it's important to add to, it's not that certainty is good, uncertainty is bad, or uncertainty is bad and certainty is good. It's more, let's attend to which things we hold certain that we want to, that we need to continue to act with certainty together, and then from that basis, gather different types of knowledge, get engaged with different types of knowledge production, different types of doubting, those kind of language games. And which things are we holding certain acting like they're the product of knowledge, but in fact they're not. They're just inculcated certainties forged in what Vicken Stein called the riverbed of our thought. And I think I really like thinking through things that way, like riverbeds, because riverbeds, when you're standing in them, you're not to be all Heraclitus-y here, but feel pretty damn stable at the time. But obviously there's erosion, there's attrition. Riverbeds do change course. And interestingly enough, it's the philosopher Olufemi Tau, not referencing Wittgenstein at all, when he talks about global racial empire, as in the 500 years of colonialism that's forged the world of power ordinances and organization as we live in it now under racial capital. He also talks in terms of riverbeds. He talks in terms of this 500 years of history as it's shaped the now, ordering the world like a riverbed, which also means that with, flows of water and selves and lives through these riverbeds, it can be redirected. And I think it's the redirection I'm interested in. Why talk of certainties at all? Why not just talk of ideology or even just hegemony? It's not like other theorists haven't gone into this. Like, am I just using certainty, Wittgenstein's notion of certainty, when I should just be saying ideology? I like using certainty because I think it points to how really hard it is to budge some of this stuff. If something's functioning as a certainty, not just a kind of, if we understand certain ideologies to function as certainties, it makes you realize how hard it is to undo them, to reroute those riverbeds. I mean, it's, I think, something a lot of people in my position now are dealing with. So I'm Jewish anti-Zionist, grew up in a completely secular, non-religious household, but with this sort of assumption that Israel must exist. And I have a lot of anti-Zionist Jewish friends who grew up in much more kind of Israel-focused households who are really struggling with their families right now because they've unlearned this thing that's held so certain as a site of Jewish identity. And I unlearned that too through not a new certainty, just kind of handed to me and inculcated through knowledge, through learning from Palestinian struggle, through informing myself or being informed, thankfully, through brilliant comrades, both Palestinian and of the anti-Zionist Jewish left, to challenge that certainty that Zionism gets to play in contemporary Jewish life. So I think that's another really, to talk about those doubt, certainty pairing. I think that's one that keeps, that was not included in the essay I wrote around this idea of Wittgensteinian certainty and political doubt. But like now the one that's really hitting me in the face every day is the way Zionism has been able to function as a certainty in the same way gender binarism does. And you realize how hard that is to budge, but that it's budgeable. Sorry, it's very long, windy.
This idea of unlearning a certainty through, again, like collective education, collective learning, through understanding different perspectives, through the dependence on our comrades to educate us, I think leads us really nicely as well to this question of how do we know the things that we don't know? How do we know the things that we are ignorant about? Because it's not this, because this is a thing, right, with regards to the power hegemony within which we exist. It's not just that we are certain of things that we think that we know, but we are also very certain of things to not exist in certain ways, like oppression, like colonization, like sexism, like racism.
I think that's a really, really good question because, how can you forge differently or, undo the things that you're taking as certain, taking for granted as organizing facts and principles of life if you don't know that there's reason to challenge them? I think that's a great question. I think what I would suggest is that it's not just a question, because we are talking about the activity of knowledge, right? And the activities of certainty as lived practices. It's not just about gaining information. So it's not just about, that, known unknowns, unknown unknowns. Was that like Donald Rumsfeld during the Iraq, the war on terror, Iraq, or was it around Afghanistan? But the known knowns, the unknown unknowns. What that means is that you just have a terrain of information that you either have access to or not. Whereas actually, the kind of practices I'm talking about are forged not by sitting and telling each other things and convincing each other and acts of discursive persuasion, although that can be part of it. It's really about how you live with people and in the world. So through and that's all kinds of activities. What is it like to live in a world where people are allowed to not perform the gender roles that were assigned to them? It's not necessarily that almost never comes about because someone sits and learns about sets of gendered practices. People break molds through experimentation and mutual experimentation and doing those sort of things together. In the same way, you didn't learn gender binarism, you didn't learn woman, man when you were a child by just getting lots and lots of examples shown to you in a book and then mapping them next to what you see. You just live in a world that inculcates accordingly, so you pick up sets of practices. So what is it to live outside of those? It can only happen through sort of not knowing in advance in a lot of ways, and I hate to sound kind of, hippy-dippy and Deleuzian and, then just forge lines of flight outside of terrains of expectation. But it is often experimental. Like, it's only through experimental practices, but collective practices, that you can make meaning differently. There's a great philosopher and human called Eva von Redeker who writes about these kind of this revolutionary praxis. And he definitely doesn't mean storm the Bastille all at once. Quite the opposite. It's what does it look like to introduce certain practices collectively that challenge violent norms, violent hierarchies in our life by bringing a crisis into being by practicing against them. It's what Judith Butler was talking about when she used the example of drag, at least having the potential to create a crisis for assumptions of gender by performing gender at itself. So it's through practices of these things, not just discussions of them, not persuasions, that, it's not like there's this set of worlds out there pre-existing for us to come to know. It's about creating spaces for knowledge, doubt, living differently through acting collectively differently in ways that are, life-affirming, non-violent, non-oppressive, non-exclusive, inclusive, interdependent. And I know, I don't like when I'm saying sentences that sound sort of hippy-dippy and utopian because it suggests, oh no, you just live differently together, prefigurative politics, boom, brand new world is open in the shell of the old. Obviously, I use the term breaking of certainties or forging doubts where certainties currently stand because it's really hard to do. And often fails and is often met, as we see again and again, with extraordinary police violence, state, corporate-backed police violence, and cages. So, and obviously that is not evenly distributed at all. The people who are most vulnerable, Black, poor people, Black and brown migrants, this is not equally dispatched in terms of violence. But forging ways to live differently often, it always, in fact, has to happen through praxis, not just persuasion and knowledge building, because it's not like those spaces of knowledge are sitting waiting for us to just kind of pick like a preformed world. That world doesn't necessarily exist yet.
I completely agree with you. I think, though, it does leave people with the kind of question of like, well, if we can't prefigure these politics with regards to this kind of like collective challenging, how is it that we go about and try it? And I think this kind of like loops us right back into the beginning with regards to certainty and uncertainty, in this sense of like, in these uncertain times, kind of the solution is almost, and I use that term very loosely, but the solution is to almost be more uncertain, to experiment, to dare, to push at the very edges of what we know, to challenge these violent norms.
with kind of almost threatening to go over the edge. And I think it's understandable that is such an incredibly high psychological barrier for so many people to go over at this time.
And it's scary, but what's definitely scary is what the if we don't, right? Like ever more precarious labor without union protections, a burning planet, a genocide playing out on our phones with our nations funding it, the uneven distribution of climate decimation, but coming for everyone, the next global pandemic, again, which will as ever be unevenly distributed. So in the knowledge that those things are, predictable, and because of the toxic certainties with which we live, those things are deeply predictable, and already happening. So I can't think of much more scary than that. So it is, embracing uncertainties away from those forms of life, yes, can be scary because we don't know what to do. What does that look like? But again, we're still not jumping into totalized doubt. What do we know? We know that we need to feed each other, right? We know that falling in love is important. We know that we want to be able to feel nourished. We know that people need sleep. We know that we want to have fun. Things that we know that you can appreciate a life forged around those terms and spreading the capacity for people to have those, or a logic of scarcity and austerity, so fewer and fewer people can engage in the things that we can sort of hold certain as worth fighting for and fighting for together, in a way that is scary, but not doing so is also scary, because then we're quite certain that the toxic certainties currently ordering the world as we live in it will continue as such. So, the other thing to think about with these ideas of rupture and breaking free from certain molds is that I do think we should keep in mind the sort of riverbed metaphor. And you can think in other metaphors too, like think of shifts in paradigms in the natural sciences. So like paradigm shift, like Thomas Kuhn talks about. It's not the case that a river suddenly would turn immediately because we've done a big revolutionary rupture in a day. And it's not the same that you have a paradigm shift in the practices of the sciences. You don't go from like relativity to like quantum physics like in a moment. The possibilities of what can resolve the crisis of a given, problem in science that a current paradigm isn't serving, and then it appears to rupture open. They always pre-exist, right? They don't appear all at once. The kind of resolution to certain crises of understanding have been and are being forged as we speak. They're being forged, by, the journalists who continue to inform us about the genocide in Gaza, risking their lives so that they can say, like, look, we're still living and we're still resisting and we continue to live, and we will fight to live, and use even like, documenting decimation and slaughter, but also documenting joy. You're watching people in the bombarded camps feeding children and playing games. Extraordinary. So like these, and I don't mean to romanticize people facing genocide. You also see every day, you see like extraordinary moments of people finding each other and finding ways to live in the world that makes it feel like it's worth living in. And I, wanting to engage in that sort of thing. I was just part of the encampment at the university I teach at, the Gaza Solidarity encampment, and it was difficult and very difficult for like faculty and students to be working together and holding space, and in antagonism with the administration and risking police raids and arrest. But it's still extraordinary that people do that, right? And it does keep happening. And then it doesn't mean it necessarily leads to that paradigm shifting, like you do see in certain Kuhnian paradigm shifts in scientific practice. But clearly what's happening now is not working for most people. And clearly only through practices of acting and living against it will other possibilities that could be forged into better certainties become possible. It all sounds very la-di-da. It's not la-di-da. It's really, really fucking hard. Changing paradigms in science never happens overnight. Changing the shape of a river takes, sadly, centuries. And I also want to reference, unless suddenly you get the one thing that can move fast, obviously, is power. You can get, massive corporations can build dams, and so can nation states in a day. So doing it, from below, changing the riverbed of our thoughts from below through collective action, is harder work. It's easier to do it from the position of pre-existing power. But I like Olufemi Taru, who I mentioned before. The way he talks about it is in terms of thinking like ancestors. So, we won't finish, which can be a bit depressing, maybe. But like the idea of not, I'm in it for the children in that sort of reproductive futurist way, but more of a, what would it look like to act now to be the ancestors we would like to be, but in a way that is in and of the now, rather than, I don't know if people know, listeners know about the long-termist movement, which grew out of effective altruism. It's a corner of weirdos in philosophy who are also like very appealing to Silicon Valley, because they're like, you know what we should really do? Think of the world, but in a billion years' time, and future lives in a billion years, when we're all, AI uploaded life forms, but, reproduced to the matter of billions, so that's more value created. I definitely don't mean thinking futurally or as ancestors in that way. I do mean it in terms of you're not going to finish the work, but you start the work, but also that creates new possibilities of living more happily together and connectedly in our own lives. And it's cheesy, but it is just better. It just feels better.
I couldn't agree with you more, Natasha. Thank you. First of all, thank you for the shout out against the EA people and the effective alpha and the long termists. They get a bad rep on Planet Critical, but it's been a while since we brought them up. So thank you very much.
I was in the same philosophy cohort as one of the founders of EA, Will MacAskill. He's Scottish guy. Seemed really nice. I think he is nice, but this is what had to beware analytic philosophy, my friends, because it can really disturb the mind. I think he just did too many, logic trees around ethical decision making, and now he thinks you have to think about digitized lives in a billion years' time rather than existing humans now. But anyway, that's my problem with that.
I think what's funny about the EA people is that it almost looks like an indigenous philosophy with regards to thinking about the future. But then essentially, when you read a little closer, it's essentially this like pollination of self into the future. Like, I will be the hero to protect the billions of the unborn because I and my, fellow intellectual cohort have thought about it to bring them into being now, rather than, the indigenous wisdom, which is like, let's think into the past and the future, 7 generations. And make decisions now that protect everyone. It's a very holistic thing, rather than making decisions today that sacrifice very real existing people today for the trillions of unborn. So it's almost like if you put everything through the maw of capitalism, it just gets chewed up, spit out, and looks a little bit funny. But Natasha, I am aware of the time, so I'm going to bring us into the final question, which is, who would you like to platform?
So, indeed, just to kind of for this very reason, what that kind of futural thinking that isn't rich and inclusive and interdependent, it actually holds the toxic certainties of the now firmly in place. I'd rather point to the sort of thinkers that do take seriously indigenous forms of inclusive knowledge building and production, and also think quite radically about how we can forge worlds outside of the most toxic and harmful certainties that we live with now. So I want to draw attention to Harsha Walia, who is an activist and a scholar who writes on border imperialism and politics of no borders. And I'm going to read she finishes, I believe, one of her books called Border and Rule, which I think is a really nice way to think about dislodging some of the more troubling certainties with which we've been trained to live. And she writes, empires crumble, capitalism is not inevitable, gender is not biology, whiteness is not immutable, prisons are not inescapable, and borders are not natural law. So I think Walia is a brilliant thinker on these kind of better ways of holding certain things certain and leaving room for more liberatory doubts.
Wonderful. I cannot wait to speak with her. Natasha, thank you so much for this. This was just excellent. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really fun.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.